"You're not who I married," she said, her voice slicing through the clinking glasses and low hum of conversation in the restaurant. My fork froze halfway to my mouth, her words hanging in the air heavier than any insult I had ever heard. I looked at her across the table, the woman I once believed was my soulmate, and I felt something inside me snap. Slowly, I set the fork down, leaned back in my chair, and said in a low, steady voice that carried more truth than anger, "Neither are you." That was the moment everything changed. That was the night the carefully painted illusion of our marriage shattered into pieces, and I realized I had been holding on to something that no longer existed. What started as a simple dinner date ended as the clearest confirmation that the woman sitting across from me was not the person I had promised forever to. And in that single exchange, I knew my life was about to unravel. But maybe, just maybe, that was the freedom I needed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. To understand how it came to this point, you'd have to know who I am, and how we even got here. My name is Adrian Vega, 36 years old, living in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Portland. I'm not the kind of guy who goes looking for drama. I work in architecture, designing homes that I hope people will fill with laughter, memories, and maybe even the kind of love I thought I had found. To most people, I look like I have it all together. Steady job, good circle of friends, married to a woman who seemed like she had stepped out of a dream. But behind the closed doors of our own house, life wasn't as picturesque as others believed. Marriage, I've come to realize, isn't defined by the smiles people see at dinner parties or the curated photos on social media. It's defined by what happens when no one's watching. And when no one was watching us, I saw a woman who was slowly turning into a stranger. But before I let bitterness rewrite our entire story, let me paint the picture of who she used to be, or maybe who I thought she was. Her name is Evelyn, and when I first met her, she was like a burst of light in a dimly lit room. We met at a community event downtown, one of those open-air art exhibits where local artists displayed their work. She was standing in front of a painting, studying it with such intensity that I couldn't help but comment on it. That led to a conversation, then coffee, then long walks by the river. She had this way of making the world feel bigger and more colorful, as if everything ordinary suddenly had layers of meaning. For someone like me, who lived by blueprints and straight lines, her free-spirited energy was intoxicating. She was spontaneous, adventurous, and she made me laugh in ways no one else could. In the early days, I thought I had hit the jackpot, that I had found someone who would balance me out, bring warmth where I brought structure. And for a while, it really was like that. When I asked her to marry me, it felt like the easiest decision of my life. We stood on a hill overlooking the city lights, and when she said yes, I remember thinking that I was the luckiest man alive. Everyone around us believed the same thing. My friends would joke about how I had somehow convinced someone out of my league to settle down with me, and even my mother would whisper that she could see the way Evelyn looked at me, like I was the only man in the room. Back then, I believed that love was enough. I believed that when two people loved each other, everything else would fall into place. But life has a cruel way of testing those beliefs. And somewhere along the line, the woman who looked at me with eyes full of warmth began to look at me with something colder, harder to define, something closer to resentment than affection. That's the thing about marriages that fail. It's never sudden, not really. It's not one fight, one bad day, or one careless word. It's an accumulation. It's the slow drip of disappointment, the erosion of trust, the subtle shift in priorities. And as I sat across from her that night in the restaurant, listening to her tell me I wasn't the man she married, I realized she was right in a way, but so was I. We had both changed, and not for the better. The people who once promised to grow together had instead grown apart. I looked around the restaurant, at other couples sharing meals and laughter, and wondered how many of them were also sitting on unspoken truths, just waiting for the right, or wrong, moment to surface. Because for me, this was it. The truth was out, and there was no taking it back. I should have felt devastated, and maybe a part of me was. But another part of me felt strangely liberated. For months, maybe even years, I had been carrying the weight of pretending. Pretending we were still happy. Pretending her distant smiles didn't sting. Pretending that the silence between us was comfortable, rather than suffocating. But when she said those words, when she looked at me with eyes that no longer held love but accusation, the mask fell away. I didn't have to pretend anymore. And that's why my reply came so easily. Neither are you. It wasn't a defense, and it wasn't meant to wound. It was the plain truth. And sometimes, the truth is the sharpest weapon of all. Before that dinner, before those words split our marriage wide open, my life had the kind of rhythm that from the outside looked steady and respectable. I woke up early most mornings, usually before the sun, brewed a strong cup of coffee, and sat by the kitchen window with a sketchpad or a stack of blueprints. Architecture wasn't just my job. It was a craft I had devoted myself to since college, a way to shape the world into something more functional and beautiful at the same time. The houses I designed were meant to be homes, places for people to raise children, host family dinners, or simply feel safe after a long day. I poured myself into that work, maybe too much sometimes, because it gave me a sense of control and purpose. And while I was drafting plans or calculating dimensions, the rest of my life seemed to stay in order. At least that's what I thought. We lived in a modest but comfortable house on Alder Lane, a two-story place with ivy climbing the fence and a small backyard garden that Evelyn used to adore. She would spend afternoons tending to the flowers and herbs, her hands in the soil, her face glowing under the sun. That garden was her sanctuary, and when I looked out the window to see her humming to herself while trimming basil or watering roses, I felt like I had built something lasting, something real. Our home wasn't extravagant, but it was ours, and it was filled with pieces of both of us. Her abstract paintings on the walls, my shelves lined with architectural books, and in the evenings, the smell of whatever she decided to cook filling the air. It wasn't perfect, but it was comfortable, and back then I thought comfortable was a good thing. To friends and family, we were the couple that had it figured out. At gatherings, people would pull me aside and tell me how lucky I was, how radiant Evelyn looked whenever I walked into the room, how we seemed so natural together. I clung to those comments because they reinforced the story I told myself, that I had chosen right, that love and marriage were supposed to look exactly like this. On Sundays we had a ritual of walking to the small farmer's market downtown, hand in hand, weaving through stalls of fresh produce and handmade crafts. She'd pick out vegetables for the week, always with this childlike excitement, and I'd carry the bags, pretending to roll my eyes but secretly loving the routine. We had our jokes, our little habits, our routines that gave me the illusion of stability. It was a life that others envied, and I believed it was a life worth holding on to. But beneath all that, beneath the curated image and routines, there was something I ignored. I have always been someone who values consistency and reliability. I like to know where I stand, what to expect, and how to prepare. Evelyn, on the other hand, thrived on spontaneity. At first, that difference felt complementary. She pulled me out of my rigid habits, and I grounded her when she got too carried away. She would suggest road trips at the last minute, dance around the kitchen while cooking, or drag me into conversations with strangers at parties. I admired her ability to live in the moment, to embrace life without a plan. But what I didn't see back then was how those differences could also drive us apart, how her need for constant change might clash with my need for stability. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Still, in those early years, our love felt strong enough to bridge any gap. When she laughed, it was like the whole room lit up, and when she looked at me, I believed that I was truly seen. I remember nights when we'd stay up until 2 in the morning, sprawled across the couch, talking about our dreams. She wanted to travel the world, to see places she had only read about, Morocco, Greece, Japan. I wanted to build something lasting, a home filled with family and traditions. We thought those dreams could coexist, that we could give each other the best of both worlds. And maybe for a while we did. But time has a way of stretching those small differences into chasms if you're not careful, and eventually, our priorities began to pull us in opposite directions. For me, marriage was a commitment, a promise that no matter how hard things got, we would face them together. I came from a family where divorce wasn't an option, not because we pretended everything was perfect, but because my parents taught me that love was about choosing each other over and over again, even when it wasn't easy. Evelyn came from a different background. Her parents divorced when she was young, and she often talked about how suffocating it felt to watch two people stay together out of obligation rather than love. To her, commitment was conditional. To me, it was absolute. We never admitted it out loud, but that difference sat quietly between us, waiting for the right time to surface. If someone had asked me then, what kind of man are you, I would have said I was a provider, a loyal husband, someone who built his life on responsibility and care. I believed in working hard, saving for the future, and investing in the life we were creating together. That was my identity, my baseline situation. I didn't drink much, I didn't gamble, I didn't run away from problems. I was steady, maybe even boring, but I thought boring was safe. And I thought safe was exactly what she wanted when she said yes to me. What I didn't realize was that in her eyes, the very qualities I believed made me dependable would one day make me unrecognizable to her. She saw stability turning into stagnation, reliability turning into predictability, and love turning into routine. And slowly, the man I thought I was, and the woman I thought she was, began to diverge until we no longer recognized each other. That was my normal. That was the life I was trying to protect, even as it was quietly slipping away. And the irony is, when she finally told me I wasn't who she married, part of me knew she was right. Because while I had clung to the image of who we were supposed to be, I hadn't noticed that we had already changed into something else entirely. It all began on one of those late spring evenings when the city feels alive, when the air carries a mix of food truck smoke, fresh blossoms, and possibility. Portland has a way of turning into a stage during those months, with streets closing down for art festivals, local bands playing on corners, and strangers striking up conversations like old friends. I hadn't planned on attending that particular event. I was supposed to be working on a design project that was due in 2 weeks, but a colleague insisted I come out, saying I worked too much and needed a break. I gave in reluctantly, not knowing that decision would change the trajectory of my life. The event was crowded but not overwhelming, a mixture of food stalls, art exhibits, and vendors selling everything from handmade jewelry to vintage records. I remember weaving through the crowd, half interested in what I was seeing, when I noticed her. Evelyn was standing by a booth featuring abstract paintings, one hand resting on her hip as she tilted her head to study a swirl of color on canvas. There was something about her stance, confident yet curious, that drew me in. Her hair caught the late sunlight, and though she was surrounded by people, it felt like she existed in her own little world. I had no reason to speak to her, no excuse prepared, but something in me urged me to step closer. "That one looks like chaos," I said, pointing to the painting she was studying, a whirl of blues, reds, and streaks of black. She turned her head and gave me a quick once-over, her lips curving into a smile that felt both amused and challenging. "Chaos?" she repeated. "No, that's not chaos. That's freedom." I didn't know it then, but that simple exchange would set the tone for much of our relationship. Where I saw disorder, she saw possibility. Where I saw risk, she saw opportunity. It was that contrast, her ability to frame the world in ways I never considered, that pulled me in. We spent the rest of the evening walking together through the exhibits, talking about art, travel, and childhood memories. She told me about growing up in a small town in Montana, always yearning for something bigger, something that felt alive. I told her about my obsession with building things as a kid, how I'd use Legos and scraps of wood to make tiny houses and imagine the families that might live in them. By the time we parted ways that night, she had given me her number, written hastily on the back of a flyer for a pottery class. I remember staring at that crumpled piece of paper on my desk the next morning, wondering if she'd actually pick up if I called. She did. And from that first phone call, it was as though a door had opened to a part of life I never knew I was missing. Our first date was nothing extravagant. Coffee at a small cafe tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. But it stretched into hours. With conversation flowing so easily, I lost track of time. She asked me questions no one had ever asked before. Not about my job or my achievements, but about what scared me, what I dreamed of when I was alone, what I thought about when I couldn't sleep. It was disarming, how quickly she peeled back layers I didn't even realize I had. In return, she shared pieces of herself with the same openness. She admitted she was afraid of becoming stagnant, of living a life that felt ordinary. She told me she wanted to see the world, not as a tourist, but as someone who immersed herself in it, learning languages, trying foods, making connections. Those early days were filled with a kind of electricity I had never experienced. We would meet after work and explore parts of the city neither of us had seen before. She took me to hole-in-the-wall restaurants, street fairs, and quirky thrift shops. I introduced her to quiet parks, hidden trails, and the architectural landmarks that fascinated me. It felt like we were stitching our lives together with every new experience, creating a tapestry of shared memories that grew more vibrant with each passing week. When I finally introduced her to my friends, they were instantly captivated. Evelyn had a way of making everyone feel like the most important person in the room. She laughed easily, asked thoughtful questions, and somehow managed to charm even the most reserved among us. My best friend Marcus pulled me aside after one gathering and said, "Man, she's something else. Don't mess this up." I laughed it off at the time, but deep down I knew he was right. She wasn't just someone I was dating. She was someone I could see myself building a future with. But even in those golden days, small differences peeked through, though I didn't recognize them for what they were. She thrived on spontaneity, like suggesting we drive out to the coast at midnight just to watch the stars. I, on the other hand, felt uneasy when plans weren't laid out. Once, she surprised me with plane tickets to San Francisco, bought on a whim with money she probably shouldn't have spent. I went along because I didn't want to disappoint her, but I remember lying awake in the hotel that first night, calculating how much we had blown through on the trip. She laughed off my concerns, saying life was too short to obsess over every dollar. I told myself these were small quirks, nothing that couldn't be balanced out. And maybe at the time, that was true. Looking back, I realized those moments weren't quirks. They were previews. Signs that the very differences that drew us together might one day pull us apart. But in the beginning, blinded by the intensity of new love, I couldn't see it. Or maybe I didn't want to. What I saw was a woman who made my world brighter, who reminded me that life could be more than schedules and blueprints. I saw someone who made me believe that love really could conquer all, if we just held on tightly enough. And so, when she smiled at me across candlelit tables or leaned against me on late-night drives, I wasn't thinking about the future cracks that might appear. I was thinking only of the present, the warmth of her hand in mine, the spark in her eyes, the rush of something I thought would never fade. There was a stretch of time when everything between Evelyn and me felt untouchable, like we were standing in the center of our own small universe where nothing could shake us. We had just moved into our house on Alder Lane, and even though it wasn't large or luxurious, it felt like a palace to us. Every room seemed to hold possibility. We would unpack boxes late into the night, laughing at the odd things we had accumulated separately and now had to merge into a shared life. I remember standing in the middle of the living room one evening, surrounded by half-open curtains and mismatched furniture, when she wrapped her arms around me from behind and whispered, "This is ours. Can you believe it?" The way her voice trembled with excitement made me feel like we were on the cusp of something extraordinary. Our good times weren't built on lavish vacations or expensive gifts. They were found in the smaller moments, the routines that became rituals. Saturday mornings were reserved for making breakfast together, her insisting on whisking the eggs while I manned the skillet. She had a habit of playing music while we cooked, usually some upbeat playlist that made her dance barefoot across the kitchen tiles. I wasn't much of a dancer, but I'd let her pull me into a silly spin every now and then, the two of us laughing so hard we nearly dropped spatulas or spilled juice. Those mornings felt like the heartbeat of our marriage, ordinary yet magical, filled with the kind of happiness that sneaks up on you when you're not paying attention. We traveled a little during those years, nothing too extravagant, but enough to create memories that stuck. A weekend trip to Seattle where we wandered Pike Place Market, eating fresh donuts and watching street performers. A cabin getaway in the mountains where we built a fire and stayed up late telling stories, her head resting on my shoulder as the flames crackled low. She took endless photos, capturing moments I might have otherwise forgotten. Me squinting into the sun as I tried to read a map, her laughing with her hair blown wild by the wind. The two of us smiling awkwardly in front of landmarks. Looking back at those pictures now, there's a bittersweet quality to them. At the time, they felt like proof of something unbreakable. Now, they feel like relics of a different life. Even at home, we built traditions that made our marriage feel uniquely ours. Every Friday night, we ordered takeout from the same Thai restaurant and curled up on the couch to watch movies, our arguments over which film to choose becoming part of the ritual itself. She always wanted comedies, I leaned toward dramas, and more often than not, we compromised on something neither of us really cared about. But it wasn't the movie that mattered. It was the comfort of being together. The shared blanket. The way she'd fall asleep halfway through and pretend she hadn't when I nudged her awake. Sundays meant grocery shopping together, bickering over brands of pasta or cereal but ultimately enjoying the routine because it was another thing we did side by side. Our families blended easily too, at least in those days. My parents adored her. They saw in her the vibrancy I often lacked. She brought color into our otherwise structured family gatherings, asking questions, telling stories, and making everyone laugh. Her family, though more scattered, welcomed me with warmth as well. I remember one Thanksgiving when we drove to Montana to see them. I was nervous about meeting her relatives on their home turf, but by the end of the weekend, her cousins were teaching me card games and her father was telling me fishing stories by the fireplace. Evelyn beamed the whole time, squeezing my hand under the table like she was proud of the life we were building together. Financially, things were stable. I was advancing in my architecture firm, landing bigger projects and bringing home a steady income. Evelyn was working part-time at a boutique while also pursuing her passion for painting, filling canvases in the spare room we had converted into her studio. I supported her dreams wholeheartedly, even when her work didn't sell right away. She'd get frustrated sometimes, tossing aside a half-finished canvas and muttering about wasting time, but I always reminded her that her art wasn't about sales, it was about expression. When she finally did sell her first painting, I took her out to dinner to celebrate, raising a glass to what I thought was the beginning of her bright future. That night she looked at me with eyes so full of gratitude and affection that I couldn't imagine anything ever breaking us apart. Intimacy, too, was abundant during those good times. We were still discovering each other, not just physically but emotionally. She'd curl up against me at night, her fingers tracing absent patterns on my chest, and we'd talk about the future. Children, travel, maybe even moving abroad someday. We had different visions, but we wove them together like strands of the same rope. She wanted adventure. I wanted roots. We told ourselves we could have both, that we'd figure it out as we went along. And maybe for a while we really believed that. There were moments of pure magic, the kind that etches itself into memory whether you want it to or not. Like the time we got caught in a sudden downpour walking home from a concert. Instead of running for cover, she started dancing in the street, spinning and laughing as her hair clung to her face. I stood there watching her, utterly captivated, until she pulled me into the rain with her. We were soaked through by the time we reached home, shivering and dripping water onto the floor, but we couldn't stop laughing. That night, wrapped in blankets, she kissed me like it was the first time all over again. It's strange how those moments stay with you long after everything else has crumbled. For years I held on to those memories as proof that our marriage was worth fighting for. Those good times were the foundation, the reason I believed we could weather anything. They were what I replayed in my mind whenever doubts crept in, convincing myself that if we had been that happy once, we could be again. That's the cruel part about good times. They give you something to lose, something to cling to even when the cracks start showing. And as much as I cherished those days, I didn't realize back then how fragile they truly were. Looking back, it's clear to me that the unraveling didn't start with some explosive argument or single catastrophic event. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, with the kinds of changes you could easily dismiss as ordinary phases of marriage. At first, I didn't recognize them for what they were. I chalked them up to stress, to routine, to the natural ebb and flow of two people building a life together. But those early signs, subtle as they seemed, were the whispers of something deeper brewing beneath the surface. The first shift I noticed was Evelyn's restlessness. During our earlier years, she had always been so present, so engaged in our day-to-day routines. She took joy in simple things, our Friday night takeout, painting in her studio, or even folding laundry while humming to herself. But slowly she began to seem distracted, like her mind was somewhere else even when her body was right beside me. She'd stare out the window longer than usual, her gaze unfocused, or she'd scroll through her phone endlessly, barely reacting when I spoke. At first, I told myself she was just tired or preoccupied with her art. But deep down, I sensed a distance forming that I couldn't bridge with jokes or casual conversation. Arguments began to surface too, small ones at first, the kind you could dismiss as nothing but the friction of two people living together. She started criticizing little things I never thought mattered. How I loaded the dishwasher, how I folded the towels, even the way I left my shoes by the door. It wasn't so much what she said, but how she said it, the edge in her tone that hadn't been there before. I tried to laugh it off, to tell her she was being picky, but she didn't laugh with me. Instead, she'd roll her eyes, retreat to another room, and leave me standing there, wondering what invisible line I had crossed. There were changes in our intimacy too, and not just in the physical sense. She used to curl against me at night, her presence warm and comforting, but gradually she started turning away, facing the other side of the bed. When I reached for her, sometimes she'd respond, but more often she'd sigh lightly, as if I had interrupted a piece she desperately wanted to hold on to. Conversations before bed, once filled with dreams and laughter, became sparse. She would claim exhaustion, pulling the covers up to her chin and closing her eyes before I could say much of anything. It wasn't rejection in its most obvious form, but it was enough to make me feel like something between us was slipping away. Socially, there was a shift as well. She began spending more time with friends I barely knew, going out for drinks or weekend get-togethers that didn't include me. When I asked why I wasn't invited, she brushed it off, saying, "It's just easier this way," or, "You wouldn't really enjoy it." That stung more than I let on. I had always imagined our social lives intertwined, but it felt like she was carving out a separate world, one where I didn't belong. I told myself it was healthy for her to have her own space, but in truth, I felt like an outsider in my own marriage. Then came the silences, the worst kind of warning sign, though I didn't fully grasp it at the time. Evelyn had always been someone who filled rooms with energy. She talked, she laughed, she asked questions. But slowly the silences grew. Dinner became quieter, drives to the grocery store filled with the hum of the radio instead of conversation. When I tried to ask about her day, she'd offer one-word answers or vague finds that told me nothing. I found myself overcompensating, talking more, trying to pull her into dialogue, but it often felt like speaking into a void. That silence pressed down on me like a weight, though I kept telling myself it was temporary. I also noticed she stopped painting as much. Her studio, once a vibrant place of creativity, became a room of half-finished canvases collecting dust. I thought maybe she was just burned out, that inspiration had hit a dry spell, but the way she avoided the room altogether made me uneasy. When I asked her about it, she shrugged, saying, "I just don't feel like it anymore." There was no elaboration, no passion in her words, just indifference. It frightened me more than I admitted at the time, because art had always been her anchor, the thing that brought her joy. If she was losing herself, what did that mean for us? Perhaps the most telling sign, though, was how she began to use the phrase, "I need space." It started casually, almost harmlessly after small disagreements. "I just need some space right now," she'd say, retreating into another room. Or if we had a longer conversation about something important, she'd eventually cut it short with, "Can we drop this? I need space to think." At first, I respected it, thinking it was healthier than shouting or saying things we'd regret. But the more she used those words, the more I felt like space was becoming a wall between us, one that kept expanding. I feared that one day, the space she craved would swallow our marriage whole. I should have taken all of this more seriously, but denial can be a powerful thing. I told myself that every couple went through phases, that we'd find our rhythm again, that stress and routine had simply dulled what once burned brighter. I clung to the memories of our good times, convincing myself they outweighed the current struggles. But what I didn't understand then was that marriages don't collapse overnight. They erode slowly, and if you ignore the erosion, by the time you realize what's happening, the foundation has already weakened beyond repair. If I could go back, I'd pay closer attention to those silences, those sighs, those requests for space. They weren't just quirks or phases. They were her way of telling me she was slipping away, even if she couldn't put it into words yet. But I wasn't ready to face that truth. And because of that, I let the warning signs pass me by, blind to the storm that was slowly gathering on the horizon. What began as subtle shifts eventually grew into patterns that I could no longer dismiss. The tension between Evelyn and me didn't stay contained in those quiet silences or small criticisms. It spread into every corner of our marriage like cracks racing across glass. At first, I told myself we just needed time, maybe even a vacation to reset things. But every attempt I made to patch things up seemed to backfire. Instead of closing the gap between us, it only seemed to highlight how far apart we'd already drifted. The arguments grew sharper. They used to flare up occasionally over something trivial. what movie to watch, who forgot to take out the trash. But now they turned into drawn-out battles that left both of us drained. I remember one evening when I got home later than usual from work because of traffic. Evelyn was waiting at the kitchen counter, her arms crossed, lips pressed tight. "You didn't even bother to text," she said, her voice flat but carrying an undercurrent of anger. I tried to explain, told her I'd been stuck in bumper-to-bumper congestion, but she cut me off. "It's not about traffic. It's about you not thinking about me at all." I stood there, stunned, because in my mind it really had been nothing more than a frustrating commute. Yet to her, it was proof of neglect, and the way she looked at me made it clear she truly believed it. Moments like that began piling up. A missed call, a forgotten errand, even a poorly timed joke. Everything seemed to be magnified into a sign of my failure as a husband. And in those arguments, Evelyn didn't just point out what I had done wrong in that moment. She started dragging in the past, listing grievances I thought we'd moved beyond. "You've always been like this, Adrian. Thoughtless. Distant." Hearing those words shook me because they rewrote our history, twisting memories I held dear into evidence against me. I found myself second-guessing everything, wondering if maybe I had been blind all along. The distance between us became more visible to others too. When we visited my parents one weekend, my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen while Evelyn chatted stiffly in the living room. "Is everything all right between you two?" she asked gently. "She seems unhappy." I forced a smile, brushing it off, but her words lingered in my mind long after. If even my mother, who had always admired Evelyn, could sense the tension, then surely it was worse than I wanted to admit. I began to realize that what we were living wasn't just a private struggle, it was spilling into how others saw us. Our physical closeness suffered too. Nights in bed became a gulf of space between us. Her back turned, my hand hovering awkwardly above her shoulder before retreating. On weekends, she often found reasons to leave the house, meeting friends, running errands, visiting her sister. When she was home, she buried herself in her phone or Netflix, barely acknowledging me. I started spending more time at work, telling myself it was to get ahead on projects, but in truth, it was easier than sitting in that heavy silence at home. Home no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a place where every word I spoke risked sparking another fight. One of the lowest points came during a dinner with our friends Marcus and Lila. We were at a little Italian place downtown, and the evening started off pleasantly enough. But midway through the meal, as we were all sharing stories, Evelyn suddenly laughed and said, "Adrian's idea of romance is reheating leftovers and forgetting our anniversary." Everyone chuckled lightly, but I saw the sharpness in her eyes. She wasn't teasing, she was taking a dig at me in front of our friends. I tried to brush it off, smiling tightly, but the humiliation burned. After dinner, I confronted her about it in the car. She shrugged, saying, "Maybe if you actually tried sometimes, I wouldn't have anything to joke about." That cut deeper than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just that she was disappointed in me. It was that she no longer protected me, no longer held our marriage as something sacred. Financial stress didn't help either. Evelyn's art sales had slowed down, and my job, while steady, wasn't bringing in the kind of raises I'd once hoped for. Money became another battlefield. She accused me of being stingy when I suggested holding off on a big purchase, while I felt she was being reckless in spending when we should have been saving. These disagreements weren't about numbers on a spreadsheet. They were about control, about values, about the growing chasm between how we saw our lives unfolding. The phrase, "you're holding me back," slipped from her lips one night during a particularly heated argument, and I'll never forget how my chest tightened hearing it. Holding her back was the last thing I ever wanted, but it seemed like that's exactly how she saw me. The escalation wasn't just emotional, it was visible in our daily routines. We stopped cooking meals together, something we used to love. The kitchen, once filled with laughter and teamwork, became a place of solitary dinners eaten at different times. I'd find her plate already rinsed in the sink by the time I got home. The living room, where we used to watch shows side by side, now had her curled at one end of the couch with her headphones in while I sat scrolling through my own distractions. We lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, but we were no longer partners. We were coexisting, barely acknowledging each other unless it was to argue. I think the moment I knew things were spinning out of control came late one night when she didn't come home until after midnight. She claimed she'd been out with friends, but there was a vagueness in her explanation that unsettled me. When I asked more questions, she snapped. "Why do you have to interrogate me? You don't trust me anymore?" I wanted to say, "How can I trust you when you won't let me in?" But the words caught in my throat. Instead, I went silent, letting her storm off to the bedroom while I sat alone in the dark living room, staring at the clock and wondering when exactly I had lost the woman I once knew. By this point, the signs were undeniable. What began as subtle shifts had escalated into a daily reality of conflict, silence, and growing resentment. We were no longer just a couple going through a rough patch. We were two people locked in a downward spiral, neither of us willing or able to stop the fall. And though I didn't know it then, the worst was still ahead. As much as I tried to keep our struggles private, it became increasingly impossible to hide the cracks in our marriage from the people around us. I had always believed that no one else needed to know the intimate details of what went on between Evelyn and me, but as the distance between us widened and the arguments sharpened, our problems began to spill into our interactions with friends and family. And when others started to voice what I had been too afraid to admit, the truth hit me with a force I could no longer ignore. It started with my younger sister, Claire. She had always been blunt, never one to tiptoe around uncomfortable topics. One Sunday, she invited me over for coffee, and after some small talk, she leaned back in her chair and studied me in a way that made me uneasy. "Adrian," she said softly, "you don't look happy. What's going on with you and Evelyn?" I tried to brush it off, saying work had been stressful, but Claire wasn't convinced. "Come on, I know you. You've got that look you used to have in college when you were pretending everything was fine while your world was falling apart." Her words stung, partly because they were true. When I finally confessed that things had been tense at home, she nodded knowingly. "I've seen the way she talks to you, the way she looks at you. It's like she's checked out already." Hearing her put it so plainly left me shaken. I wanted to defend Evelyn, to insist that things weren't that bad, but deep down, I knew Claire was only saying what I had been unwilling to admit. At work, one of my colleagues, Henry, picked up on the changes too. We used to eat lunch together a few times a week, and one day he looked across the cafeteria table and said, "You've been distracted lately. Is everything all right at home?" Normally, I wouldn't have opened up to a coworker, but something in his tone made me feel safe enough to share a little. I told him things were rough, that Evelyn and I had been arguing more. He gave a slow nod and said, "I went through the same thing a few years ago. My ex-wife and I tried to hold it together, but sometimes when someone's heart isn't in it anymore, no amount of effort can change that." His words echoed in my head long after, unsettling me. The possibility that Evelyn's heart had already left our marriage was something I hadn't been willing to face, but Henry's matter-of-fact tone made it feel like a reality I couldn't escape. Then there was Marcus, my longtime friend. He and Lila had been there during the dinner when Evelyn humiliated me with her offhand joke, and he later pulled me aside when we met up one evening for drinks. "I've got to be honest with you, man," he said, swirling the ice in his glass. "That wasn't right, what she said. Joking's one thing, but the way she did it, it felt like she wanted to cut you down in front of us." I tried to laugh it off, but Marcus shook his head. "Don't laugh it away. I've seen you two together long enough to know something's changed. She doesn't look at you the way she used to. And you don't look at her the way you used to either." The concern in his voice wasn't mocking or judgmental. It was the concern of a friend who had watched me slowly unravel and couldn't stay silent any longer. Even Evelyn's sister Marissa, who had always been close to her, reached out to me one afternoon. I was surprised when she called. We had never spoken at length without Evelyn present. Her voice was hesitant, almost apologetic. "I don't want to overstep, Adrian," she began, "but I can tell she's pulling away. I know my sister, and when she starts talking the way she has lately, it means she's questioning everything." My throat tightened as I listened, torn between gratitude for her honesty and despair at what it implied. If Evelyn was confiding in her sister about doubts she couldn't share with me, then maybe she really had already decided I wasn't the person she wanted by her side anymore. All of these conversations weighed heavily on me. I realized that the people closest to us could see what I had been denying, that Evelyn and I were no longer aligned, no longer fighting for the same future. I had always assumed that if I just tried harder, if I was more attentive or patient, things would naturally get better. But the outside perspective painted a harsher truth. No amount of effort on my part could make Evelyn want something she no longer wanted. The validation from others didn't just confirm my fears, it also gave me a strange sense of relief. For so long, I had felt like I was going crazy, like maybe I was imagining the distance or overreacting to her coldness. But hearing Claire, Henry, Marcus, and even Marissa voice the same concerns reassured me that I wasn't losing my mind. What I was experiencing was real, and it wasn't just in my head. That validation was painful, but it also cleared the fog. I could no longer cling to illusions. The marriage I thought I had was slipping away, and pretending otherwise would only prolong the inevitable. One night after another argument with Evelyn, this time about money again, I found myself sitting alone in the car, parked in front of our house, unable to bring myself to go inside. Claire's words came back to me. She's checked out already. Marcus's warning echoed too. She doesn't look at you the way she used to. I stared at the porch light, glowing faintly in the darkness, and felt a hollow ache in my chest. I realized then that I had been waiting for Evelyn to meet me halfway, to show even the smallest sign that she wanted to rebuild with me, but all the outside voices had made it clear. She wasn't meeting me halfway because she no longer wanted to. For the first time, I let myself consider that the marriage I had been desperately trying to save might already be over in her heart. And once that thought took root, I couldn't shake it. The people around me hadn't just validated my fears, they had forced me to confront the truth I had been too afraid to see. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. The moment everything truly broke wasn't loud or dramatic in the way I might have once imagined. It wasn't some screaming match that ended with doors slamming or plates shattering against the wall. It was quieter than that, almost eerily so, but the silence of it struck me harder than any argument ever could. It happened one evening at a small restaurant where we had once celebrated anniversaries, birthdays, and milestones. I had chosen the place deliberately, hoping that the familiarity might spark something between us, some small reminder of the connection we once shared. I thought maybe, just maybe, if we could sit down in that warm, candlelit atmosphere where so many good memories lingered, we could find a way back to each other. We sat across from each other, menus in hand, but the distance between us felt greater than the table that separated us. Evelyn barely glanced at me, her eyes flicking over the wine list instead. I tried to start a conversation, asking about her day, her painting, anything that might draw her out. She responded with polite, clipped answers, never lifting her gaze long enough for our eyes to meet. The waiter came and went, taking our orders, refilling our glasses, but it was as though Evelyn and I were strangers forced to share the same space. Then, in the middle of the meal, she put her fork down and stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Her voice was calm, almost detached, when she said, "You're not who I married." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I froze, the piece of bread in my hand forgotten. She continued, her tone sharper now. "You've changed. You're not the man I thought I'd be with forever." For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My first instinct was to defend myself, to argue that of course I had changed. We both had. That was the nature of life and marriage, wasn't it? But before I could speak, something inside me shifted. Because as I looked at her across that table, I realized something that had been lingering at the edge of my awareness for months, maybe even years. She wasn't the same woman I had married either. The light in her eyes, the warmth in her smile, the eagerness to build a future together, all of it had dimmed, replaced by bitterness and resentment. Whatever bond we once had long since unraveled, and we had been clinging to the frayed threads out of habit, not love. So instead of arguing, I set my fork down and said the only words that felt true, "Neither are you." My voice was steady, but inside my heart was pounding. The look on her face shifted from surprise to anger. But I didn't flinch. For once, I didn't back down or try to smooth things over. I simply let the truth hang between us, like a blade cutting through the pretense we had been holding on to. The rest of the dinner was painfully quiet. She pushed her food around her plate, and I barely touched mine. By the time the check came, I knew there was no salvaging the night. We drove home in silence, the only sound the hum of the tires against the road. When we got inside, she disappeared into the bedroom, slamming the door behind her, and I stayed in the living room, staring at the darkened TV screen. That was the night I knew with absolute certainty that our marriage was no longer something I could fight for. The days that followed only confirmed it. Evelyn withdrew even further, speaking to me only when necessary. When we did talk, it was cold and transactional, like roommates dividing chores. One morning I found her sleeping in the guest room, her excuse being that she needed a better night's rest. But we both knew it was more than that. We were no longer partners. We were just two people occupying the same house, waiting for someone to finally say the words that would make it official. My rock bottom came not just from her words at that dinner, but from the realization that I had been losing myself in the process of trying to hold us together. I thought back to the man I used to be, the one who laughed easily, who dreamed big, who believed in love as something unbreakable. Somewhere along the way I had let go of him, bending and twisting myself to try to keep Evelyn happy, to try to make our marriage work, but no matter how much I gave, it was never enough. And in doing so I had lost the very core of who I was. One evening, I sat alone in the living room with a glass of whiskey in hand, staring at the framed photo from our wedding day. We looked so young, so hopeful, our smiles wide and genuine. I studied Evelyn's face in that photo, trying to reconcile it with the woman sleeping in the next room. It felt like I was looking at a stranger, and then it hit me with piercing clarity. We had both changed, but instead of growing together, we had grown apart, and there was no amount of denial or effort that could turn back the clock. That was my moment of absolute clarity, the breaking point where hope finally transformed into determination. I couldn't keep living in limbo, clinging to the remnants of something that no longer existed. It was over, and deep down we both knew it. I set the photo back on the shelf and whispered to myself, "It's time." That night marked the end of my denial. It wasn't just that Evelyn had spoken the words out loud. It was that I had finally accepted them. The man she married was gone, but so was the woman I had married. And all that remained were two people with nothing left to give each other. The morning I finally made the decision felt strangely calm, almost anticlimactic compared to the storm of emotions that had carried me to that point. I woke up before dawn, the house still and quiet, with only the faint sound of Evelyn breathing in the guest room. For the first time in months, I didn't feel the familiar knot of dread in my stomach. Instead, I felt something closer to relief, like a weight was beginning to lift before I had even spoken a word. I brewed a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the steam curling upward as the first light of day crept through the blinds. It was there in that silence that I admitted to myself once and for all. This marriage had run its course, and the only way forward was to let it go. I didn't feel anger anymore, or even sadness, just a quiet acceptance. I realized that staying any longer would only mean betraying myself, and perhaps even betraying Evelyn, by forcing us both to live in something that had long since died. Later that day, I asked her to sit with me in the living room. She looked wary, as though she already knew what was coming. I took a deep breath and told her, simply and directly, "I think it's time we end this." There was no shouting, no tears, no desperate attempt to argue. For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes narrowing, as if she was trying to gauge whether I was serious. When she finally spoke, her voice was flat. "So, you've given up then?" she asked. I shook my head. "No, I'm finally accepting what's been true for a long time. We've both changed, and we can't keep pretending we're the same people we used to be." She didn't reply, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel compelled to fill the silence with explanations or apologies. I let the words stand on their own. In the days that followed, we began the slow, painful process of separating our lives. We divided up the bills, the furniture, even the books that had lined our shelves. Each item felt like a small piece of history being pulled apart. But, strangely, I didn't feel as broken as I thought I would. There was grief, yes, but beneath it was a current of liberation. I had been holding on so tightly for so long that I hadn't realized how much energy it had been draining from me. Now, with every step towards separation, I felt a little more of myself returning. Evelyn, for her part, kept her emotions tightly guarded. She moved through the motions with a kind of mechanical efficiency, boxing up her belongings and setting them aside without a word. Occasionally, I caught a glimpse of something in her eyes, a flicker of regret, perhaps, or fear, but she never voiced it, and I no longer felt the need to pry. The day she officially moved out was a gray, rainy afternoon. I helped her carry a few boxes to the car, and when we stood on the porch for the last time as husband and wife, there was a moment where I thought she might say something. An apology, a goodbye, a plea to reconsider. Instead, she just looked at me, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then turned away. I watched as she drove off, the taillights disappearing down the street, and when the house finally fell silent again, I realized I was standing in the middle of my freedom. It didn't feel triumphant, not in the way I once imagined it might, but it did feel right. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild my life piece by piece. At first, it was the small things: rearranging the furniture, repainting the living room, reclaiming the spaces that had once felt suffocating. Then it was bigger steps, like reconnecting with friends I had neglected during the turbulence of my marriage, or diving back into hobbies I had long abandoned. I started running again, something I used to love but had given up when life became too heavy. Each stride on the pavement felt like a reminder that my body and mind were still capable of moving forward. Slowly, I began to rediscover the parts of myself that had been buried under years of compromise and conflict. There were, of course, moments of loneliness. Nights when the silence of the house pressed in too heavily. When I reached for the other side of the bed only to find it empty. When I questioned whether I had made the right choice. But those moments were fleeting, and with time, they grew less frequent. More often, I found myself feeling grateful for the clarity I had gained, for the strength to finally let go, and for the opportunity to rebuild my life on my own terms. One afternoon, weeks after the separation, Evelyn called me. Her voice was shaky, and before I could even ask how she was, she broke down in tears. She said she regretted how things had turned out, that she missed me, that maybe we had given up too soon. I listened quietly, but the strange thing was, I didn't feel the pull to run back to her. I felt compassion, yes, and even a twinge of sadness for what we had lost, but I no longer felt the desperation to fix things. I had already moved on in my heart, and I knew going back would only undo the progress I had made. Gently, I told her that I hoped she would find peace, that we had shared important years of our lives, but that chapter was closed. She cried harder, but eventually she said goodbye, and when the call ended, I sat there in silence, feeling a deep and unshakable sense of closure. Looking back now, I realized that ending the marriage was not a failure, but a necessary act of courage. It forced me to confront not only the truth of our relationship, but also the truth of who I had become. For too long, I had lost myself in the effort to save something that couldn't be saved. But in letting go, I found the strength to reclaim my own life. The scars remain, as they always do, but they no longer weigh me down. Instead, they remind me of what I endured, and of the resilience I didn't know I had. The future is still uncertain, and I won't pretend that everything is perfect now. But as I stand on the other side of this journey, I know one thing with absolute clarity. I would rather face the unknown with my freedom and my sense of self intact than remain trapped in a love that no longer exists. For the first time in a long time, I feel ready, not just to move on, but to truly live again. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.